Hi, thank you, Alex, and thanks for coordinating this effort, this series. This is, I think, a really good thing for the community. Today, our topic is zoning. And just so you know, this is just one in a series of different events that will occur with related topics occurring in July, August, and September. I'm Greg Patton. My title is I'm the Strategic Development Manager. I work in the Department of City Development. I work in the planning section. I've been in DCD for the past 14 years, and I get involved with long-range strategic projects. I've worked on things such as the downtown zoning, or the downtown plan, the Lakefront Gateway, and I work on a regular basis on urban design review and development review for specific projects. Prior to that, in the prior 13 and a half years, I was a plan examiner first in the Development Center, and that's where Alex resides. And as time went on, I became my title changed to being the zoning specialist, and I was a part of the 2002 zoning recodification. That was a major overhaul of the code. And so it's kind of my background and my experience on this topic. But the items that we're here to talk about today, the three things that were bulleted, the purpose and the structure and the resources, there's a few other items that I think we'll talk about in the course of this, more some background and process. We'll talk about zoning districts and zoning design standards and understanding other zoning concepts. So do many people here use zoning or know zoning or understand it in the room? Is it any, okay. It's something, zoning can seem complex, but if you take it in a very logical, step-by-step manner, can be quite rational and easy to, I won't say easy, but reasonable to figure out. And today I think I want to really try to help you understand how the code works and how to use the code yourself, how you can look something up, how you can figure out something. It's a really powerful thing to have that knowledge and like how to understand zoning. The big goals of zoning, there's some really big goals, and this is zoning. This is not just Milwaukee, but this is wherever zoning is typically in place. It's really, one of the big things is to protect property. In other words, if you have your house, the last thing, you want to make sure there's an orderly sort of pattern of things going on. If you have a certain size house, you don't want someone, all of a sudden your neighbor building out to the front property line or doing something unusual on your site, which really doesn't fit in. So you're really protecting other property owners. The other thing is, the other big topic is it's also a tool to implement land use plans. The Department of City Development is involved in creating those plans, and they follow planning principles which we have established, and they're in a number of different areas. And probably the last thing, the major point of zoning, is to regulate maintenance of properties. Back to the comprehensive plans, we have 14 area plans in the city of Milwaukee, and a tool to implement an area plan. Area plans are when a neighborhood, an area, an alderman's district, all the collective of those things come together and really come up with a collective vision for an area. So the tool that's there to help implement that is zoning. It's often zoning. There's multiple tools, many tools, but it's a powerful tool to implementing a land use plan. The zoning code goes into 22 different points of why we have zoning. And I think they're all good, but it's kind of a long list. I'm not going to read that, but it's right in the very opening of the zoning code itself. Where is zoning applicable? Well, things I work with a lot in my area in the developments, in planning, and when I worked in the development center, were really development-oriented things. But then there's also the maintenance of properties. I'm going to jump to that quickly. And that might be maintenance of properties. Zoning affects, like if you're going to put temporary signage in a window, or how many cars can be parked out behind a building. More of the things where you're not proactively, per se, doing something, but it helps to regulate, keep a neighborhood or a business street kind of in a better sense of order. But really, the areas which I work on mostly is really the use of property, the development of property, and people when they want to make a change to a property. And that can be anything from a large Northwestern Mutual tower in downtown to someone's backyard shed. Zoning is applicable across a wide spectrum of types of buildings. What zoning is not, and this sometimes people get a little confused, it's not the building codes, that's a separate topic. ADA is covered in the building codes. Licensing, that's a different thing. Licensing is not zoning. Health permits, historic, ARB, architectural review boards, things in the public right away. Those have different, they do have regulations, these other things. But our Lunch and Learn series is covering topics on those other areas. So hopefully you'll come to those other sessions to learn about those other topics that zoning is not. As I had mentioned earlier, the zoning codes are constantly changing. We've had a zoning code in Milwaukee since close to its founding, and the zoning code obviously has changed over time. When I came on board in the around 1990, we were using what was called the 1986 zoning code, and it had already been it had gotten quite outdated by 2000. So what happened was a committee was formed, and we did a major overhaul of the code to kind of align with more current planning principles. But recently, we've been we do other zoning projects. We instituted a new commercial district for a more intense zoning, like you'll find in places like East North Avenue, and new zoning districts that deal with industrial mixed areas where land is transitioning. And we currently are working on updates to our landscape code, and we're also working on a transit-oriented development plan, which would include zoning, which would have zoning implications. And so we do zoning code updates on a yearly basis, usually a couple times a year. Sometimes they're small, sometimes they're, as we call the word omnibus, that they're like many things in an ordinance to kind of clean it up. So zoning, so one thing to understand about zoning is it's constantly changing. Milwaukee, the way we do it is zoning is a part of another permit. In other words, if you're applying for a building code or building permit, they're going to look at things that relate to the building code for that, but they're also going to look at the zoning code. So in other words, that zoning approval is integral to the permit. That could be an occupancy certificate as well. When you go to take out an occupancy certificate, what the inspectors are going to be looking for is the health and safety and the building code compliance of the space, making sure it's safe. It's for fires and things like that, and you aren't exceeding maximum capacity. But in that zoning, in that occupancy certificate, there also will be a zoning check. And one thing should be noted that in some cities it's done differently. Some cities they have a separate zoning permit, and we don't. That's not the system on how we're based. Who administers and enforces, DNS plays the primary role. The development center for where Alex comes from is, and where I used to work, is the place where that's the primary point of contact on zoning matters. And generally that's the place with both for coming in to discuss zoning or for calling to understand zoning. But I think what I'm trying to show you today is how you can be a little more self-sufficient in terms of you can find out information, so you don't always have to make that call or stop on by. I think if you can understand some basic places to go to look for zoning, it'd be very helpful. My department, the Department of City Development, we occasionally become involved in things like when there's an overlay. Overlay might be a good example of an overlay is downtown on the river. We have what's called an overlay district. We look at how building standards are met within 50 feet of the water's edge. So that's an example of the kind of thing that DCD would get involved with. The other thing we get involved with, and I'll talk about this more as we get further on the presentation, is zoning changes. And that might be the changing of a zoning to a different district, or it also might mean changing it to, it's a different district, but a planned development. And that's kind of a custom zoning. But we'll get to that a little later in the presentation. There's other related things that people perceive as zoning. They're really not zoning. Architectural review boards, we have two of them. We have the historic Third Ward, the East Side, North Avenue. Those are our architectural review board. The project in those areas needs to meet zoning, but then those review boards are reviewing for an additional higher standard. And as well as historic, if you're in a historic district, a certificate of appropriateness is needed from the Historic Preservation Commission. And that, again, that is, you still need to meet zoning, and call it an extra step that you must do in that kind of area. So just sometimes people get confused that zoning is the historic, and it's not really looked at. Now really getting down to the essence of it is that really zoning comes down to two things. There's a zoning map and a zoning code. And one thing that's really important is every property has a zoning designation. The key is to learn, figure out what your zoning designation is of your property, and I'll show you how you can get to figuring out what's allowed and so forth. Sometimes people use the words, they said, my property is zoned for a restaurant, or my property is zoned for this. It's not really, and it's a subtlety, but it's important to understand. Your property is probably zoned, it may be zoned local business. And in local business, LB2, a restaurant is one use, but it's one of many permitted uses. This sometimes confuses people, because like if you understand your zoning district, then there's a litany of different uses that are permitted in that district. Let me show you. Like say, for instance, you'd like to build a building for an intended use at a specific property. And you want to find out if your use is permitted and what you're thinking about on your design, if you can do. I picked out, I was looking at, what we have is, this is a really important link. It's our Map Milwaukee Portal. And this is something that we'll share with you at the end of this. But Map Milwaukee is a really great tool, because within Map Milwaukee, you can go to property zoning information on here. I have the direct link to that. And what that'll do is it'll bring up a map that shows, it's basically a map of the city, which shows all the different property. And on that, you can zoom in on that, and if you click on your property, what'll pop up is a information box. And in that information box, there's a lot of vital statistics. The zoning is on there, the lot size is on there, probably assessment on most, things like that. So it's an important way to find out what the property is. Now I was looking at the example. I found there's a redevelopment authority owned property on King Drive. So I was like, okay, so what's its zone? So I click here, and it's zoned LB2. Now, with knowing that, what you do is you compare that to what's allowed in the zoning code. And I'll just show you, don't be daunted. It's 11 chapters in our zoning code. But I think a better way to understand it is the zoning code in Milwaukee is based on these 11 chapters. There's one chapter, the first 4 chapters are things that apply across the board, throughout the whole city of Milwaukee. And chapters 5 through 9 are very specific to the district that you're in. And chapter 10 and 11 are overlay districts. So that kind of explains, you have your different sort of areas of this. Let me deeper dive into the district chapters. Now remember, we had just said that site we were looking at was zoned LB2, local business. So what we're going to do is we want to look at the chapter in which those regulations are located. That would be in, these are the 5 different chapters that all the districts would occur in. But this kind of gives you an example of the different districts. So if you go to the commercial districts, you'll find that local business zoning is found within in the commercial code. Let me back up just so we can see how this is developing. So all these different chapters, the different sort of zoning districts, all deal with a use and a design characteristic. These different districts, explaining the districts, this kind of is going back to the background of the code. This is a map of the city of Milwaukee. And Milwaukee, as you know, the oldest part is towards the center, where it's the pattern of how things look and feel, from about, say, Capitol to Oklahoma, from the lake to about 50, to about, I don't know, Hawley or something, there's a certain character to it. It's an older character where buildings are usually on smaller lots, buildings have smaller setbacks, and as we use the word context, the context has a more urban character. Then as you get further to the northwest or to the the far south or southwest, it's districts that were developed later. You'll see that most of the properties were developed probably in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and typically they have more auto accommodation and they have larger setbacks. So there's a different character, and likewise downtown. We all know that downtown and the areas around downtown generally are taller and denser and bigger, and so there's a classification of districts. So the reason we have these different districts is they're really meant to the districts are meant to reflect the context. What you want is you really hope to have a neighborhood zoned appropriate for its context. In other words, like this is just a few examples. This isn't everything, but like when you're on the further northwest or southwest side, the apartment buildings and things like that in a residential district have a larger lawns, they're farther set back, it has a different character. As as you're kind of going to areas like, as you're getting closer in, back to this map, as you're coming in this middle zone, or that owner zone, you start having buildings that have that start to become closer together, they're denser, and the scale increases. Same thing occurs with a range of different districts in, let me skip to this one. In the commercial districts, we have neighborhoods like on the far northwest side, when you think of like North 76th Street, or you think of South 27th Street, those areas are zoned local business 1, LB1. It's a lower level of density. It's usually a little larger parking lots, things like that. In the more traditional urban streets, that could be, North Avenue, King, it could be Lincoln Avenue, it could be Mitchell. Generally, those are zoned LB2. As you can see, there's a difference between a 1 and a 2. Just like as the numbers go up, they're denser. We created a new district recently called LB3, which was really East North Avenue, because there was a real community desire for a greater density there, and that actually fits better with that characteristic. In areas such as Walker's Point, we have an area called industrial mix, and it's kind of considered that a mixed-use area, but it's transitioning. It's industrial now, and it's transitioning more into more of a commercial mixed-use neighborhood. Just to kind of, here's another important link. So these are those districts I was telling you about, but this is another important link. This is on our DCD. What we've done is we actually have links to the LRB code, so you can easily go by chapter. And this page, really, you can right away on our page see what district you are. Click on the link, and it'll take you to the appropriate chapter. So it's an easy way to get from, what your zoning district is, and you go to this web page, you'll be able to go and say, oh, there I am. I can see here that I'm zone LB2, so I'm a commercial district. So I click on that, and then that would open up the zoning code, the pages of the zoning code. But let me explain how these chapters work a little bit better. So you'd open up, when you'd look at the district chapters, here's the link to that. As we were saying before, every one of these chapters is structured, talks about use, and then talks about design. And each of these chapters have a parallel structure, hopefully so that it makes it clearer, so that way you can follow it a little bit easier. With use, if you have a land use is like, is it a restaurant? Is it a retail store? Is it a laundromat? Is it daycare? That's when I say the word use, that's what I mean. And what we have is we have use definitions that are in our code in Chapter 2 that will help you if you have a question. Well, what exactly am I? I'm a recycling center. Where does that fall? What's my definition? Well, by looking at the definitions, you can go to the use table. Let me jump right to that. And in the use table, each one of these, you can find your district. I was looking up LB2 here, and I said I want to open a general office, and you can say yes. It's a yes. So there's different options in these charts. Is it yes? That means it's permitted. L means it's a limited use. I'll explain that in a second. S is a special use. That means it needs the Board of Zoning Appeals approval. And N, that means it's not permitted. So basically, I should have had this slide up when I was talking. But the idea is, depending on what the use is in the table, it really tells you basically your direction. And if your use, and you go to the table and your use is simply a Y, you're permitted, then you come in to get your occupancy, say for a retail store, pretty much there's no zoning question. Move along. Say, for instance, if you're in that local business spot and you're a daycare center, and that needs then it's S, that's a special use. Well, then what you would need to do, special use means something that's generally acceptable, but needs a case-by-case review. So what that would mean is you would have to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals to get that zoning approval from the Board of Zoning Appeals. And if it's prohibited, then if you'd want to move forth with a use that wouldn't be permitted, then you would need to seek a variance from the board. And obviously the test of a variance is much more than the test of a special use. A special use is something that's generally acceptable, but site specifically, it needs to be reviewed to make sure there's not neighborhood impacts that make difficulties for the surroundings, but they're also to make sure there's a plan of operation that's submitted. But if it's a variance, it's something that's generally kind of sways far away from what that district area was intended to have. Like I was showing you that example where a lot on King Drive, I was trying to look up, if I wanted to LB2 and I wanted to open a restaurant, I could go to the table and I could say, yep, that's permitted. it's permitted and move along. If I found, oh, it's a daycare, I'd have to go to the Board of Zoning. But like, say I wanted to open a recycling center. Well, that's not appropriate for a street like that. So generally, something like that would be a no. So with a non-permitted use, you'd have to seek a variance, and the test to meet that, we would also look at our comprehensive plans in these cases to see how if our plans recommend zoning changes, if our plans would support a certain sort of use. So there is that background that goes into that. There's going to be a session on Board of Zoning Appeals upcoming in, I think, July or August. There's one other type of thing in zoning with use, and that's called limited uses. And that's where what happened, uses were getting approved, going to the Board of Zoning Appeals, and they were getting approved always with the same conditions. So what happened was when we redeveloped the code in 2002, we said, well, if it's the same condition, like we want to limit the hours of a business, like so that you're not open past 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, and maybe you have to provide loading for that use or something, a loading zone or something like that. There are certain things that you need to provide with that use, and we kept saying it over and over again. What we did was we created this category called a limited use and a limited use standard. So you'll see like here where there's something as a limited use, there might, like for instance, a theater is permitted just as a matter of right if it doesn't exceed 49 people. So if it's a small like neighborhood theater, some sort of performance place, no Board of Zoning Appeals is needed. However, if it starts to become a large facility, well then a Board of Zoning Appeals is needed. Why would that be? Probably once a facility gets large, there's a lot of traffic, a lot of things going on. And that's why the board wants to ensure a plan of operation is in place to follow. Let's talk about the other half, design. Design is really kind of brought down into the big things is you have the principal building, which is the main building on a lot, and then you also have like accessory structures, like you have like a house has a shed in the backyard, or that could be even a shed to a business in the back, and then site standards. Properties usually that they have a parking lot, well, there's standards that go with that, and what about signs? So each of the chapters, each one of those chapters 5 through 9, residential, commercial, industrial, downtown, and special districts all have tables like this. And what the table does is what you do is you look at, here's my example, the LB2, and you go right down here and it says, is there a front setback requirement? No, there's the maximum is the average. Is there a side street setback that's on the side of a property? Yes, it's 5 feet. How much can I build up? Is there a glazing requirement? So the idea is they're set up in these tables. So the idea is once you know your zoning category, even though it's a table, you can just ignore all the other columns and just look at your column, basically. These things deal with, this is kind of the wider array, but let's break this down. For design on the principal building, this is really about 6 items that are dealt with that are addressed in the chapters of the different districts. And that's really deals with building placement and street orientation and bulk and height. And it also, like entrances. One of the important things that entrances are either facing the street or on the street side of a building or just around the corner, no more than 20 feet. Glazing, most districts have a glazing requirement. I should say most commercial districts have a glazing requirement. It's a certain amount of the wall that you must have windows in, and that's within this pedestrian realm. And that has to do with that's reinforcing one of our planning issues, is that we want to see that buildings activate the street. It's also important when you have things like the windows, is it's not only it's good for the business, but it's also eyes on the street. One of the things too is, if you're familiar with SEPTED principles, we want to make sure when a building or a property is developed, you don't have long walls where people, where bad activities can happen or people can graffiti or whatever. So the idea is it's very important how walls of a building facing the street are articulated and how they're glazed. As you can see in this diagram here, and this is some of our online things, we also talk about the landscaping, but I'll show you the standards to that in a second. This is an example in our LB3 district, which requires a bigger building. This is on East North Avenue. There's a minimum height to the building, and there's a maximum build out of the street. So these are the kind of bulk things that are dealt with in the zoning chapters of the code. Also, when you talk in these chapters, it talks about other things on the site, and that could be things like pedestrian walkways. One of the important things we want to see on a site is that if a building is set back, because it might be maybe it's a grocery store, maybe it's a convenience store, and it's set back further, what we care about is that that there's pedestrian linkages. So somebody who's not driving to the site, but taking public transit or living in a neighborhood and walking to the site, there's a clear marked walkway that goes to the building. So a lot of older buildings in Milwaukee don't have that, but when buildings are remodeled or new buildings are developed, we make sure that we have those pedestrian connections. The other thing too is also like things like screening. There's some examples of having screening walls that hide dumpsters and the loading docks and things like that. So those are other things that are included in the site standards for the code. The other thing is signage. Each district has got requirements for signage and how much signage is allowed on a building. Each one of the chapters, residential, commercial, industrial, downtown, and special, they each all have a signage chart like this. So you can find your district, and if you want to do a freestanding sign, it'll tell you, okay, I can have a sign up to, it's going to be, let's say a wall sign, I can have it up to be 50 square feet if it's type A or 25 square feet if it's type B. The big difference on a sign like that is, we prefer in signage to see signs that are high quality, individual letters, like backlit, and just a better quality looking sign. So you'll find that the zoning standards promote you doing a better quality sign. And if you can only afford a simple plastic face sign, that's fine, but you have a smaller size sign is allowed. Let me get back to, we were talking about the districts and what happens in each of the districts. Let's talk about some of the things that are across the board. And the general provisions deal with basically these topics: the motor vehicle parking, bicycle parking, landscaping, signs, and then some other things like lighting, transmission towers, small energy wind systems, some of the things that would be anywhere, they could be in any of these districts. So these items apply across the board. One of the major things that's been recently updated in our zoning code is bicycle parking, and bicycle parking is now required for many uses. And I should say most, but pretty many uses now. And we also, with bicycle parking, we want to make sure there's facilities for people who either live at the building, who work in the building, and then we want to make sure that there's parking for people who are coming there to visit. If you're a retail customer, or if you're it would be if you're a retail customer or you're a delivery person, you want to make sure there's bike parking available. Another thing is landscaping is covered in the general provisions. With landscaping, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create, really create a street edge along the parking lot edges. And there's a lot good that comes from. Not only does it look better to have the greenery, the landscape along the parking lot, it also creates a nice defensible space, so it's very clear the parking lot is private property, this is the public sidewalk. So there's a lot of positive benefits that come from that. This kind of shows a diagram that we have on our website, but the idea is that there's a base level plantings with landscape, and we want to make sure the view is you can see into a parking lot. We don't want to hide people in a parking lot. And then the crown of trees up above that helps to kind of fill in the gaps between buildings and things like that. This is something, non-conforming uses. People this is a word that's always tossed around, and it's a little confusing. But let me explain. Non-conforming uses is something, it's not, you can't create, the other term for this is grandfathered. Oh, that's grandfathered. This is the way something is non-conforming or grandfathered, they're the same thing, is that when they built it, the code allowed for that to happen. They allowed that use to be there, or they allowed that building to look like that, and it's grandfathered. In other words, the code changed. So today the building it doesn't comply with the current code, or the use is no longer complying with what uses are allowed today. So that's how something becomes grandfathered, and it's important that a permit record needs to verify that previous use. You want to make sure if someone says, oh, that's grandfathered for that, they have a record, they have an old occupancy certificate, they have an old permit. Because a lot of times it's a term it can be tossed around and confuse people, but it's important that if something is grandfathered, it's well established. let me talk to the special districts. These are kind of unique. The first two, I'm not going to get too much into detail. Parks District is as it sounds. It's a zoning for parks and open spaces in Milwaukee. Institutional districts are the type of zoning you would apply to something like a large hospital campus or a school campus. But these two other ones are ones that we get involved with. And actually, DCD, in our planning area, we touch on these planned development districts and redevelopment districts. Planned development district is something where is that basically when you create a planned development district, you're essentially establishing the zoning for that district. That zoning, it should be consistent with what's around it. It shouldn't be something that's wildly different than the neighborhood. But what happens is the proposal that you want for a site you may wish to see it be denser. You may wish to see less parking, more parking, or setbacks are different. So it's basically like a custom zoning for a site. So it's site specific is how it works. And it's meant to allow flexibility to a project. There's an upside to the zoning in that you can tailor the zoning to fit what you're intending to do with a property, but at the same time, you need to, when you submit your plans to get your detailed plan development approved, you pretty much have to stick to exactly what you submit. So it can be difficult because a lot of times when you're developing a property, uses can change, design can change, and then that means a trip back to going through the approval process. So there's upsides and downsides to any sort of zoning change. A lot of more larger, more complex projects will use the plan development process. And you can see a lot of the arena district area, because they're such unique buildings, they're so one of a kind. They created a plan development to address those unique buildings. And there's a few buildings, like there's some buildings on the east side, another building in Harambe that's being built, and they didn't quite fit in with zoning. So there's a plan development that's created to make those buildings be able to have them fit their zoning. So in other words, keep in mind the zoning was created to allow for this height, this size, this many units, and these materials to be used, the brick, the stone, whatever the materials might be. And that needs to be adhered to because the plan development is the zoning. If you want to find out what the details of this is another important tool. It's called Legistar. This is a link that there's about 5 or 6 links we'll give you at the end that are probably the most important things to look up anything or to try to find out anything. Legistar is a system with most cities have a system like this, and it's our legislative reference bureau. That's people here at the city clerk's office maintain this, and these are like official files, and it's for things that pass through the Common Council. And the Common Council committees generally always end up in this Legistar system. So what you can do is you can search a property and find out details about a property. And this is something that's if you know something is a detailed plan development, the information about it would be located in this spot. Let's go to another special district. It's called a redevelopment zoning, or it's referred to as RED. Well, RED is a zoning that really parallels with a redevelopment plan. And usually this is areas where it's large parts of our city where it's a major change to that area. 2 of the examples are the Park East downtown, and that's pretty much that whole area when you come off the highway, or from about 7th Street all the way up along the river, and it's this whole large area it's called the Park East Redevelopment Area, and that has a separate sort of code that's very specific and fine-tuned for that area. Another one is the Beer Line, and that's along the river from Pleasant to Humboldt Street, and that area had a very specific regulating plan. So those would be things where you would look at these plans, and they have specific regulations for each of these plans. One of the last topics is the overlay zones in the code, and of these we have the neighborhood conservation overlay, the interim study, a development incentive zone, and a site plan overlay zone. I want to really concentrate on 2 of these. The neighborhood conservation overlay zone, it's for an area where it's a neighborhood where there's distinctive features. You want to make sure it's above what's normally allowed or required by zoning. But the idea is you want to make sure you preserve those characteristics. One such area is in the Brewers Hill Harambe neighborhood, for instance. Wanted to preserve that buildings they weren't looking to see for residential homes, not a flat roof or a building with a garage at the front or a non-pitched roof. So there's a couple of regulations. They're really small in nature. It's not a big, long list, but these are certain things in an overlay. So an overlay can establish additional requirements for a neighborhood. Another such area is down in Bayview along South Shore Drive, and it was limiting things such as flat roofs and reducing the height of buildings a bit. So there's a number, one of my last points, development incentive zones. There's a number of these. Development incentive zones is an overlay to the zoning. The base zoning still stands, but there's additional regulations. A good example to this is the Brewery District in downtown, just northwest of downtown. It's the former Pabst Brewery site. And with there, you have, the basic zoning still applies for use and height and all the other parameters. But what you have is just some additional regulations in this overlay for the brewery. Here's another example of a site. This is called Holt Plaza. This is down on Holt Avenue and Chase Avenue, and it was a development with larger retail stores, Pick and Save, and a Home Depot, and then a number of outlots and other things and other developments. Well, this is a case where the overlay zone actually had some additional standards, making sure how the pedestrian walkways were set up, how the landscaping was shaped, where buildings would anchor the corners of this larger parking lot, and so those are things that are above and beyond the basic zoning of the neighborhood. So we're getting into conclusion here, but moving your project forward. If your project, when you look up your zoning, your project is permitted or meets the limited use standards, you simply move forward on that. So that's checked. That's good. If your project meets design standards, move forward, and you prepare the required plans and information submittal to plan examination. However, if the project use is not, if it's a special use or the project's design does not meet design standards, then a number of things may happen. You really, basically, some things with, if you're a special use, you would go to the Board of Zoning Appeals. You could also pursue a variance through the Board of Zoning Appeals. However, that test is much tougher, as I was mentioning, than a special use approval. Another option, if there's a number of items and the project is quite different, you could do a zoning change to a different district or possibly a planned development. But again, it's probably best to stay within the zoning. And the last thing is to really modify the project, because sometimes if you're going to do something, it might be something small. You might be in compliance if you have a use, and maybe if your hours of operation are less or some other factor like that, maybe then it's permitted because of a limited use standard. Or possibly with the design, if your project, if you modify it and add in the required windows on the front of the building or a door facing the street, things like that, you're probably better off modifying to meet the zoning. Our encouragement is that you work to meet the zoning both from a use and a design standpoint. But there'll be more on July 22nd about the Board of Zoning Appeals and how that process works. These were the links I was mentioning, but we'll be putting this online, talking to the people, technical people here helping, and they're saying that what we'll do is we'll link this and we'll put this up on our web pages. Should have a pretty clear link on this. So I think that wraps it up then. But anybody have any questions?
Well, yes.
I have a question. Would you be willing to share your PowerPoint?
Yes, we're gonna make it available. We'll have both the PowerPoint available as well as this presentation. We'll actually do a link to watch the actual presentation. So yes, and then we'll send that out through the same network of information.
So who will be sending it out?
Probably be through city, like our media people.
So I'll be able to go online and type in what city of Milwaukee?
Yeah, eventually. We're working. We'll edit it and then
It'll be done soon.
Then it'll be posted online.
Of the city of
on
Milwaukee
the city website.
Okay.
Correct.
For the overlay zone?
Yes.
How's that listed when you look at the code? Like if it's like an LD to
Yeah.
or something, or will it have like another code or how?
Good question.
Or we just find out when you...
Well, let's see. This is a good question. go to my Milwaukee home, Kristen? My colleagues are here, who I work with, and I'm gonna, there's a really neat web site here, and I was looking up, let's just,
Next one is the Harambe one.
yeah, I'm gonna, let's see. I'm gonna do something else here. I'm gonna open up, and I wanna go to something that I know it'll be in Harambe, and make sure it opens up right. This will answer a question. Does it work? Tim, this is my Milwaukee Portal. This is, I just want to find a property with an address that's in the district. So let me go here. This is how it looks when you go to open this up. It takes a minute, it loads. Lovely. Oh, no.
Doesn't have the plug-in.
Oh, it doesn't have that. Okay, well,
Okay.
yes?
If you go to my Milwaukee home and do like 5800 West Hope Avenue, that's an address within an overlay.
Oh, okay, let's try that then.
How it
Terrific.
shows. My Milwaukee home is probably the most straightforward way.
Yeah. Oh, my. I got it. I'm getting there. Patience. You said 5800
Yep, West Hope Avenue.
West Hope. 5800. A lot of operator error here going on. West. Oh, duh. Doesn't even know how to use his own website. West Hope. So this is like when you get to this link, this is a pretty nice tool. I'm looking for Hope Avenue, right there. And then submit address, and then it'll, see, it comes back with information on the property.
Special interest.
And we go to special districts, we probably should note that. And what is the zoning? It's zoned RB2, residential. It's, no, that's regional business 2. Is my property in an overlay zone, and it's a development incentive. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure this tab to click on, I'm going to put that on the links, just so that might be a step that people don't find. And then it takes me to overlay districts, and that is the Midtown Center. It's a Midtown Center. And then here, what you'll find here is you'll have the permitted and prohibited uses. So this tells, the special things, what goes on there. And then also, if you got a map, it'll show you, like, this is for the area that used to be, that's Midtown, the former Capitol, former Capitol Court. So the properties within this blue boundary, this is very, it's just a small number of properties. This is a little different. Harambe's a much larger area. But nonetheless, in that My Milwaukee Home tab, it helps you to understand, other things about these special interests. And if you click to RB2, I think it would take you to the overall zoning code.
So in that, right there, will it explain to the person what an overlay zone is?
Yes, because this one takes you to our webpage, and then it explains what a development center overlay, and it tells you what that does. And these are the ones that exist in Milwaukee here. With the neighborhood conservation zone, you would also come here, and if you want to go to, like, say it's in Harambe, you go here, and now you can see, if you want to look, just to make sure your property, there's a map to make sure your property's in that area here, or, and then the development standards, here's the requirements, and then neighborhood plan must go to the, and this kind of explains what it's about. So it's kind of like, by using these couple links, these, roughly about 5 links, you can pretty much navigate to most things that you'd want to look up. But you have to always go and figure out what is the zoning of your property. And obviously, an overlay, you raise a great question, making sure by going to My Milwaukee Home, you can see if it's an overlay district. Hope I'm not confusing more than helping. One other source is, let's go back to, I'm going to go back to our resources, DCD planning pages. What we have here is the plan. If you have a link, again, this is one of the critical links. And really, if you want to check, if you want to see the City Plan Commission, what's happening, and if you want to say, oh, what happened is with the last meeting, oh, there's the agenda, I can open that. Those are the things that were there. Or if, if I want to find out what happened, this gives you the results of a meeting. But nonetheless, this resources page is a really helpful tool. Also here is you'll see the quick zoning check of a property. That takes our page takes you to that, which is maybe an easier way to go. And we also have a lot of these things, the zoning code diagrams and things like that. We have more information, like you want to learn about our new bicycle ordinance, and then you can see something like this. It'll open up presentation on the bicycle ordinance, so you can see what that was, what that change was, what happened with that. But that's the sort of it's quite a large repository of information for a lot of things that you can find at our city website. And likewise, if you want to go and learn about landscaping, and you want to find out about parking lot perimeter landscaping, that's a diagram that I've shown. But if you really want to find out what the standards are, you can open this up, and it tells you about what you need to do. So there's a number of different diagrams and other things like that on the web pages. Yes?
Question about non-conforming uses or
Yep.
grandfathering. So if you have a parcel that's been grandfathered and say you have a old, ugly-looking parking lot,
Okay.
What sorts of changes might trigger you to lose the grandfathering or trigger you to have to comply with the new landscaping
Sure.
requirements?
That's a good one. That happens a lot. You'll have parking lots that just, from years and years ago, it was established as a parking lot. One of the key things is you really needed to make sure that it's always been a parking lot. The best thing to do is that there's something on record that showed a parcel as a parking lot. If sometimes what happens is someone just tears it down, right? They throw gravel on the lot, right? And they just start parking on it. That's not grandfathered. It has to have been established as a parking lot. So if there's some permit record that showed it being used legally as a parking lot, then it can remain that way. However, if you start doing changes to that, then standards would apply. In other words, if you're going to repave it, say it's gravel, and then people, I just want to pave it now. Well, when you pave it, then you have to bring it into compliance with the current standards. And that might, you got to first of all make sure it's permitted in that spot, but then chances are you'll probably have to do some landscaping along the street, meeting the landscape code requirements, any interior parking lot landscape. So there's a number of things. And then there's other building code issues that, if you take a parking lot that was, now you're getting rid of its grandfathering, you may have to do things like plumbing in to put a drain for stormwater drainage, things like that. Could have a stormwater management plan if it's a big one. But so there's a number of things. And that's something that when you establish it, what you would do is in the development center, you would look in microfilm records would be the key source, and that's on the first floor of the 809 building. And if you need help there are people that can, where Alex, the department where Alex is at, and they can help establish that. But you want to make sure when you find something that's grandfathered, that's a terrific example, that you really need to find some documentation that it truly is grandfathered. Because you wouldn't want to base all your plans, or you're buying a property and you think you can just change it, and then all of a sudden you're hit with, oh my God, I got to spend $30,000 to upgrade this parking lot, because that could really harm a small business person. So you'd want to make sure where your status is correct. Yes?
Question about the special uses, you still need to get approval from Plaza, right? Is that, generally speaking, do they generally approve them? For any, if it's a special use?
Well, special uses, there's some criteria that it has to meet. First of all, we turn in information, and they'll get more into that in the 22nd 23rd. I keep saying 22nd. People are going to show up on Sunday looking for a meeting. But what they're doing is that they're looking to see that we're looking for consistency with the comprehensive plan. Like, in other words, sometimes the area, we have plans for the neighborhoods, and sometimes the plans will be somewhat silent on that, and other times the plans will be specific that in a certain stretch, we don't want to see any more parking lots or some other use that maybe that we're trying to discourage that use. So that comes into the weighing in on the matter. With a special use, generally a special use is usually being looked at to see if it is having negative impacts on neighbors as well. So, if it was a parking lot that supported a late night business, for instance, that could be an issue, and the neighbors would come to the hearing, and if it's something that's going to support a late night business, that could be a concern. But if it's just a parking lot for, say, maybe an office next door or some houses, it may not be as much in question.
Other questions?
You gotta have questions. I just want to offer a little bit of advice, because no matter what your project is and you go and you're the best reader and you can understand all the code, I'd still walk in, I'd still double check, verify all the information, always grab someone's card who you speak to, write down what they tell you, don't tell you. In some cases, the code is what it is, but sometimes there's an exception to the rule. You got to know how to do it. Bullseye isn't a scary process, but it's a long process. You got to tack on time, tack on more money, tack on another application. So when your proposed development doesn't fit that, and they tell you you're denied, go over to Bullseye for a special use or a variance. Got to tack on more money. Got to extend 6 to 8 weeks, in some cases maybe more, depending on how well you can put your application together. But you can't ask enough questions of enough people to make sure that what you're getting is accurate, because...
Why don't you stand up for the people?
Oh, hi.
And let them know who you are. Let's walk to the front.
I'm Alderman Perez. I represent the 12th District, and I have just a little bit of experience with development. I had a company for a short time before I got elected, and I realized how difficult it is, for one. And if it wasn't for my business partner who had a company doing construction, and that's how I kept food on the table, was hustling work on that side, because the development is extremely difficult. But in my experience, even my neighbor complained to me. He wanted to put up a pergola. He went into the development center, just doing some research, got one story. When he went to pull the permit, it was a different story. So you always got to make sure you double check, ask enough questions, get people's cards, make sure you review what they tell you, what it is. I had them print out a bunch of stuff for me on the code and write down their name and number on there, because you just cannot ask enough questions and have enough information when you do so.
Absolutely good tip. The other thing too is that, just because I don't want to give the impression that if you look up at the property, say you want to use a property, you want to change the use, you want to make it a retail store, and the zoning says, oh, retail store is permitted. Well, that's good. You've checked off, that zoning box may be checked off, but then all of a sudden you're changing the use and there's steps to get in. Well, there could be an ADA, Americans with Disability Act requirement. So there may be other issues. So when you're going to do a project, if you're going to occupy, if you're going to rent a place, or you're going to develop a place, you want to make sure that you're talking with Plan Exam, so that none of those, you don't want to have those other issues that you don't really look through very carefully come up and bite you, and you want to make sure that all those necessary steps are taken. So,
on its face value, it could seem like it's permitted. Then when you realize you want to go above 49 people, you have to sprinkle a place. You know how expensive that is?
Yep.
Things of that nature. And if you're developing a space for someone else,
Good example.
and you've worked out exactly what they need it for, and you're set on rent, all of a sudden you're incurring the cost. You have to think twice about that. So you got to be careful falling in those traps.
Hey, I'm Alderwoman Malala Cox. One suggestion I would give, he mentioned BOZA. If you do have to go through BOZA to get a special use permit or a variance, it does take a minute, so you should build that in to your timing for your project. But also, if it is something that the alderperson of the district agrees with, there's oftentimes an opportunity to get it okayed ahead of time if they are willing to sign on to it. Most people don't know that, but for some projects that is there as an option. if the alderperson of the area agrees with it.
A conditional approval.
Conditional approval.
Right. You take the risk, like say something outside of everyone's control, there's a reason it gets voted down, and you started building something, it'd be your risk. But nonetheless, it helps move things along sometimes where there's a lot of times, time is usually of the essence on many things in life.
We will be definitely covering BOZA, licensing, and plan developments on the next Lunch and Learn, because those are topics that are confusing, to say the least, but are definitely needed for the general public to understand. And so that's why we took some of the items away from that next Lunch and Learn so that we could focus more on the BOZA process, plan development, and licensing, so that we can truly flesh out questions that the public has about these issues and the processes.
And every alderperson governs their district differently. We encourage people to talk to us only because we want the process to go smoothly. We want to eliminate red tape, not that you need our permission per se to open up a business, but in many cases, from knocking on doors, from being in the neighborhood, you need to know there's X, Y, and Z who live on the block, won't support any business would. Because if you apply for a variance, in many cases, when you talked about approvals in general, when there's a complaint on a variance, those are very hard to get. When the public complaint on a special use, you can negotiate, and I think you have an easier way. But getting a lay of the land, coming in, wanting, and always get all the contingencies you can up ahead of time. That, all this is contingent on you understanding the permit process, approval process. You don't want to get a property or secure a property and figure out you can't put it to use for what you intended for. And don't forget, tenants are everything. Without someone paying the rent, you won't get nothing done. So people forget that. People think you just happen to develop a great building, put a for rent sign, and it's going to get rented. That's not the case. We've got a lot of empty storefronts. So.
And to your points here, remember, we're talking about zoning here today, licensing, building codes, licensing. These are things that are beyond this, and they're going to have this in the other sessions. Licensing is a good example. A use, like for instance, the zoning might allow, say, a tavern, local business, but maybe it's a license is a separate issue. So sometimes the use might be allowed, but it may not. The license may not be something that that the aldermen in the neighborhood support. So you have to you always want to make sure that you're always looking at the various sorts of approvals you need. Don't get pigeonholed. Just because you met the building code and just forget about zoning, or you meet zoning and then you forget about something else. You got to make sure, and that's why going in and talking with somebody as you're pulling together your project is really important, because the worst thing to do is forget something. That's a critical thing.
How many people know you can do a courtesy inspection? Okay, so you can set up a courtesy inspection. In many cases, it's worth, I think, the $250 that you pay. DNS will wrap a team or a couple of key people and do an inspection of the site and let you know these are some of the bigger ticket items that you'll need to be code compliant for the use you want. And in some cases, you can go through that courtesy inspection and realize, you know what, sprinklers, having to do stormwater management on the grass that's behind there because I plan on making it parking. All these things, it could add up and you're like, this is not good. So you could walk away from that.
Is that for vacant buildings only that you want to develop with, or what if they're occupied? You can pay $250?
Well, if you can get access to it, yeah. It's any building that you may, if you're interested in purchasing a building and/or it's a vacant building and you want to do a courtesy inspection,
Okay.
in some cases people will think $250 is worth understanding in general some of the bigger ticket items to get a code compliant.
Okay. Will that tell you for like testing? Will the ENS tell you what testing you have to do to retain that $250?
They'll let you know.
Okay.
They'll be very thorough.
Okay.
And then it'll be easier to budget your project,
Yeah.
or calculate that.
So as we come to an end, I just want to say thank you to the Department of City Development and to the presenter today. Let's give them a round of applause. I want to say thank you to each of you for coming out. today to learn more about zoning. We hope that these lunch and learns, myself, Alderman Perez, and Alderman Rainey, along with LISC and Department of Neighborhood Services Department, DCD, started this in effort to share the information, be as transparent as possible to help people be able to develop more. We are trying to build a better Milwaukee, and we need each of you to help do that. So whatever information we can provide to make it easier, that's what we're trying to do. There is a survey on the table outside to let us know what we need to do better. The next one is the 23rd of July, covering the things that he spoke about. Please spread the word, share it with people. It's free and open to the public, and thank everybody for participating today. And I don't know if there's anything else that you all have to close with, but thank you.